The United States of America was built upon a lie. Imagine, if you will, the United States without New York, without Chicago, without Los Angeles. Now erase the entire industrial heartland of the Midwest. What you are left with is not an empty wilderness, but a continent whose original towering metropolis has been systematically forgotten. Before the Founding Fathers signed the Declaration of Independence, before the Puritan settlements, before the arrival of Columbus, there stood an American metropolis more powerful and populous than London or Paris. It was built with monumental pyramids of earth, laid out with astronomical precision and ruled by sun kings who commanded the lives of thousands. This was Cahokia, the greatest city north of Mexico, and it was entirely indigenous. The fact that you did not learn its true history in school is no accident. For over a century, the ruins of this magnificent civilization posed an existential threat to the American project of manifest destiny. The government, the scholars, and the media united to construct the greatest historical lie in American history, a pervasive mythology that claimed the true builders were a lost white race, clearing the way for the physical and intellectual conquest of a continent. This is the story of America's first empire, its catastrophic fall, and the deliberate erasure of its memory. In the early 19th century, as settlers poured into the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, they encountered not a pristine, unimproved wilderness, but a landscape scarred by the monumental remnants of an ancient, astonishingly advanced civilization. These were the mounds, tens of thousands of them, dotting the American interior. They were not mere burial plots, but colossal, engineered structures of geometric perfection and scale. They included platform mounds, flat-topped earthen pyramids like the one at Monk's Mound in Illinois, that served as bases for temples or the residences of the ruling elite. There were geometric earthworks in Ohio, such as the Newark earthworks, featuring perfect circles, squares, and octagons, spanning square miles, precisely aligned to the extreme rising and setting points of the moon over an 18.6-year cycle. This required immense astronomical knowledge and stable, centralized power. Furthermore, gigantic earth sculptures, like the quarter-mile-long Great Serpent Mound in Ohio, acted as solar and lunar calendars. These structures, built over a period of 4,000 years by successive indigenous cultures, were undeniable proof of an organized, sedentary, mathematically and scientifically sophisticated society. The very existence of the mound builders was an immediate political crisis for the nascent American state. The core argument for forcibly removing Native American tribes was the principle of terra nullius, that the land was empty or unimproved, and the indigenous peoples were wandering savages with no established claim to it. The mounds flatly contradicted this premise. They represented massive, long-term investments in agriculture, construction, and centralized government. Faced with this contradiction, the intellectual establishment of the young United States did not change their narrative about the indigenous people. They changed the builders' identity. The official, pervasive, and politically convenient mythology that swept the nation during the era of the Trail of Tears was the myth of the lost white race of mound builders. The theory held that the contemporary Native American tribes were too degenerate or unskilled to have created such wonders. Therefore, the builders must have been a superior, non-native race, often claimed to be white or Proto-European, or derived from fantastical sources like the Welsh Prince Madoc or the 10 Lost Tribes of Israel. This advanced race was then tragically annihilated by the ancestors of the current Native Americans, proving the latter's savage nature. The ultimate, devastating conclusion: the European American settlers were not conquering the land, they were reclaiming it as the racial and cultural heirs of the original white builders. This lie became the dominant historical and archaeological dogma, serving as a perfect justification for the Trail of Tears and the displacement of native populations. The most spectacular and frustrating piece of evidence contradicting this theory was the colossal ruins of Cahokia, located directly across the Mississippi River from modern-day St. Louis, Missouri. Cahokia was the heart of the Mississippian culture and the undisputed capital of the largest indigenous polity in North America. At its peak, roughly between AD 1050 and 1350, Cahokia was a sprawling, planned metropolis with a population of 10,000 to 20,000 people in the central city and possibly another 30,000 in surrounding villages. Its population exceeded that of almost every contemporary European city. Dominating the landscape was Monk's Mound, the single largest prehistoric earthwork in the Americas.
It is a four-tiered, flat-topped pyramid covering 14 acres at its base, larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza's base, and stands 100 feet tall. It contains over 22 million cubic feet of earth, moved by hand in baskets. This required a massive coordinated labor force and a ruling class capable of compelling the work of thousands over several generations. The flat summit once held a colossal structure, a temple or the residence of the supreme leader, visible for miles. Surrounding Monk's Mound was a meticulously planned urban center. A 40-acre central plaza was leveled with extraordinary precision, and to the west, large circular arrangements of red cedar posts, wood henges, served as astronomical calendars marking the precise rising points of the sun on the solstices and equinoxes. The central, elite precinct of the city was surrounded by a massive 2-mile-long defensive palisade, requiring thousands of logs, rebuilt several times, hinting at periods of military threat. Cahokia was a highly stratified, urbanized society with specialized artisans and long-distance trade networks, an indigenous imperial center. The most astonishing and disturbing secrets lay within Mound 72, a smaller mound that was a lavish funerary complex for the city's highest rulers. Excavations revealed the burial of a single paramount leader, the Sun King, laid out on a bed of nearly 20,000 marine shell beads meticulously arranged in the shape of a falcon warrior. The Sun King's resting place was the ultimate statement of divine, unquestioned authority. The sheer volume of shell beads alone represented a massive, century-spanning commitment of labor, sourcing the shells from the distant Gulf Coast, carving them, polishing them, and transporting them hundreds of miles inland. Each bead was a token of absolute fealty, a currency of power paid to the celestial ruler. Surrounding the Sun King were multiple mass graves that proved the Cahokian state engaged in large-scale ritual human sacrifice. The most shocking discovery was a single mass burial containing the skeletons of 53 young women aged 15 to 30. They were all healthy individuals, neatly stacked in 2 layers, with forensic evidence suggesting they were ritually executed to accompany the leader in death. The discovery horrified modern archaeologists not because of the sacrifice itself, a practice known throughout ancient empires, but because it utterly refuted the American historical myth. This was not the simple egalitarian society of the noble savage invented by philosophers. This was a powerful, theocratic state willing to exercise supreme, terrifying authority over its population. Other pits contained the remains of men and women who had been violently executed or dismembered. In total, Mount 72 contained over 270 individuals, many of them victims of ritual execution. This confirmed Cahokia was an absolute state that operated with a level of organized complexity and cruelty that had been vehemently denied to the native cultures of the New World.
Around AD 1350, the lights went out in Cahokia. The great city was abandoned, emptied of its vast population. This sudden, almost total collapse remains one of the greatest unsolved archaeological mysteries. The abandonment appears to have been an orderly exodus rather than a quick slaughter. The people did not die out, they simply left. The descendants of the Cahokian people are the ancestors of modern tribes such as the Osage and the Quapaw, who carried the Mississippian traditions south and west. The reasons for the collapse are multifaceted: environmental disaster due to continuous timber harvesting and subsequent erosion and flooding, political fragmentation and internal revolt due to the extreme social stratification, or even disease and climate shift from the onset of the Little Ice Age. Whatever the precise combination, the city was silent by the time the first Europeans arrived. The 19th century scientific establishment took this silence and twisted it into absolute proof of their lost white race theory. The century following the Louisiana Purchase saw an aggressive campaign of archaeological fraud and historical denial, with antiquarians searching the mounds for any shred of evidence of a white skull to publicize. This era of pseudo-archaeology was not a mistake, it was a mission. Figures like Josiah Priest, whose book American Antiquities and Discoveries in the West was a bestseller, filled with fantasies of bearded Welshmen and Hebrew immigrants, provided the essential intellectual ammunition for the policy of native removal. These books were not history, they were propaganda, widely consumed by the public and often cited in congressional debates regarding land ownership and native treaties. The denial was not just intellectual, it was physical. Across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, settlers actively destroyed the evidence that refuted the lie. Farmers plowed over smaller mounds, leveling them for agriculture. Entire mound complexes were annihilated to build roads, railroads, and town squares. In Cincinnati, the massive earthworks that once stood proudly were dug up and carted away to fill low ground and pave streets. The physical monuments of native genius were systematically erased, not always out of malice, but often out of sheer convenience of land development, coupled with the comforting lie that the mounds held no true historical value. Locals referred to Monk's Mound not as the relic of a glorious native civilization, but simply as La Butte de Saint Louis, the Hill of St. Louis, utterly denying its artificial, man-made origin. The truth was not merely ignored, it was bulldozed. This systematic destruction made the work of the few honest archaeologists nearly impossible. The few who dared to suggest that the native tribes themselves were the builders, like Henry Brackenridge in the early 1800s, were publicly ridiculed, accused of treachery, and professionally isolated. The pressure to conform to the manifest destiny narrative was overwhelming. To claim that a sophisticated civilization was destroyed by an invading white force would have been to admit to a national crime. To claim that the current native tribes were the heirs to that civilization would have been to invalidate the entire frontier project. The lost white race myth solved both problems, casting the settlers as benevolent reclaimers and the indigenous people as mere squatters.
The true reclamation of Cahokia's history began in earnest with the work of modern archaeologists like Melvin L. Fowler in the 1960s. Fowler's team correctly mapped the Woodhenge, proving that the Cahokians were highly skilled celestial observers and surveyors, capable of advanced astronomical calculations. The sophistication of the trade routes, copper from Lake Superior, shells from the Gulf Coast, and the uniformity of the ritual iconography confirmed Cahokia was the focal point of a regional empire. The evidence was now overwhelming. The political structures needed to rule such an empire were clearly present. Fowler's work shifted the focus from the identity of the builders, which was already settled in the scientific community, to the details of their society, what they ate, how they governed, and why they disappeared. This painstaking research revealed a complex agricultural base centered on a highly developed strain of maize, supplemented by pumpkin, squash, and foraged wild plants. The diet was robust, but highly vulnerable to climate shifts and environmental degradation caused by the city's massive size. The final, definitive refutation came from the establishment itself, the Smithsonian Institution. Tasked by the government with scientifically resolving the mound builder question, the Smithsonian launched a massive, federally funded excavation project in the 1880s under the direction of Cyrus Thomas. Thomas was initially a believer in the lost race theory, which only makes his final conclusion more powerful. His team spent years meticulously excavating thousands of mounds across 17 states. They analyzed pottery, tools, skeletal remains, and construction methods.
The findings were unanimous and devastating to the national myth. There was no evidence whatsoever of a non-native race. The pottery styles, the skeletal measurements, and the gradual evolution of building techniques all pointed to an unbroken cultural continuity between the mound builders and the modern Native American tribes. Thomas's 1894 report on the mound explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology officially concluded that the mound builders were the direct ancestors of the modern Native American tribes. This report should have been the end of the matter, but it wasn't. The historical lie was so deeply embedded that the truth was simply too inconvenient to accept. The findings were published in academic journals and government reports, but were largely ignored by the popular press, which continued to peddle the old myths. The myth had become a matter of faith, not fact, in the American narrative. The ultimate resolution required a political and ethical reckoning. The passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, in 1990 fundamentally changed the relationship between American science and Indigenous history. For decades, hundreds of thousands of Indigenous remains, including those from the mound builder sites, were stored in museum basements. NAGPRA mandated that these remains be returned to the federally recognized tribes that could prove cultural affiliation. This process of repatriation forced institutions to formally and publicly accept the direct linkage between the archaeological remains and modern tribes like the Osage, Caddo, and Muskogee. The mystery was solved. The lost race was found. It was the very people the American government had worked for generations to erase from the historical narrative. The ruins stand as a permanent marker of the cultural memory stolen to justify a nation's expansion. The final enduring mystery of Cahokia is not archaeological, it is human. While we know who the builders were, we will never fully comprehend the nuances of their lost empire. The names of the Sun Kings remain silent. The exact nature of their catastrophic collapse, whether it was a final bloody revolt against the sacrificial elite or a mass migration induced by famine, is a void in the historical record. The mounds today, stripped of their original wooden temples and defensive walls, retain only the echo of the people's immense labor. The true legacy of Cahokia is twofold. First, it is a testament to the astonishing complexity and ingenuity of pre-Columbian North America, a civilization that built cities and observed the stars with precision. Second, it is a chilling monument to the power of intentional historical censorship. The most difficult truth for a nation to face is not what happened centuries ago, but the deliberate, organized effort to fabricate a lie that served as the foundation for its wealth and expansion. The story of the mound builders, therefore, is not a dusty footnote in history. It is the key to understanding the deep, persistent conflicts over land, identity, and truth that continue to shape the United States today. Reclaiming the true story of Cahokia is a fundamental act of recognizing the full, complicated, and astonishing past of the continent itself.